Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for our conference call today about how donor segmentation and lack of real donor journeys may be costing you donations. Hopefully, we'll be able to put together not only what isn't working, but some ideas for things that will work and can work for your organization. I'm Nick Ellinger. I'm Donor Voice's Vice President of Marketing Strategy. With me is Kevin Schulman, Donor Voice's co-founder and partner with the organization. Feel free to, we are recording this call, so you will be able to review back to it and hear our melodious voices once again. Slides will also be available if that's helpful to you. Just drop us an email at one of these two email addresses. Feel free to ask questions as we go through the presentation. You will not interrupt my train of thought, as I very rarely have one. So starting off today, this is sort of the traditional segmentation picture that you have. Your goals here are, with any segmentation, are to minimize the differences that you have within a group, maximize the differences that you have among groups, and that's usually what's talked about. But there are a couple other important aspects that you want to look at. First is it profitable to treat these groups differently? Yes, your groups may look different, but if there's not any difference in the way they react to your marketing message or in the way they engage with your organization, then they're all part of the same segment. Treat them as such. The other part is you want to make sure that it helps predict future performance. How, by putting people into these groups, am I going to know more about them and how they behave, both from a psychological perspective, but also from a performance perspective. And so this segmentation here might make sense if we're selling orange, green, and blue clothing to people who use exclusively that worldview, but that grouping may not work well for will they donate to your organization. And so if you have different people in different groups who want different things, it's not a segment, it's a joke. And so we can do better in terms of our segmentation to make sure that we're getting to a segmentation that makes sense, one that isn't a black box, you know what goes into it and what comes out of it, and you are able to understand what that segment's needs are based on who they are. Those needs and what they need from your organization matter because that's what you're going to be communicating back to those folks. And so the segmentation is the beginning of the discussion of why people give and why they stop. You have to start with a theory of change that starts with who people are and why do they do what they do. Then when you have that, you can unearth that set of questions and then you can ask yourself, does that answer differ by group? And if so, how do we group based on that people? That how question gets to the question of what data do you use for your segmentation? What methodology do you use for that segmentation? Because the devil really is in the details. You can be using first-party data, the data that you have on your CRM. You can be using data on someone else's CRM, which has a pretty good reach but is down in quality. And you can use third-party data. That's everyone's data. And third-party data has been in the news recently because Facebook has said it's no longer accepting third-party data. It's just using the things that's indigenous to Facebook. And the thing is that that data was never really all that valuable. Sure, you got great reach on it, but the assets that you have as an organization are your donor base and your unique knowledge of that, because we know that our donor bases also donate to other organizations. So that's a shared resource to some extent across different organizations. But if you know why that donor is donating to you and what their story uniquely, you have an advantage over the other organizations who are going after those donors for the same dollar. So that first party data is where we're going to focus today. We're going to use that data for strategic segmentation. We're going to answer the why questions, not the who questions, not the what questions that we too often get into in segmentation, but why do they give to your organization? Because that's what you're going to be able to play back to them, and that's what's going to make them donate over the long term. So not all types of data are equal, but then again, not all first-party data is equal. You have all of these things that can be appended uniquely to your file. Demographic comes from third-party data, but you could ask for that information. You can ask race and sex and income level and those sorts of things. You can learn what channels they give through, either by asking or by divining for how they've reacted to you in the past. You can use transactional information, and that's RFM, recency, frequency, monetary value. I got a question, is anyone else getting an echo? So if you are, please ask it and I can try to ameliorate that. And then getting down to user revealed content. And this is where we think a lot of the gold lies, especially around identity. We want to go through each type of first-party data and say which of these is most valuable for you in the segmentation. And spoiler alert, we're giving you your M. Night Shyamalan twist up front. It's going to be that user-revealed content, and it's going to be about the identity that you have that is related to your organization. And we'll have a number of examples of both how you can learn that and how you can implement that and how other organizations have used that to great effect. So let's start off with demographics. And there's a great quote from Todd Yellen, Netflix's VP of Product Innovation. And you talk about a company that has so much first-party data based on your behavior, based also on things that you've told them, the up or down thumb, but mostly on what did you watch, when did you watch it, did you watch the thing right after it, when did you stop, all of that sort of thing. And so they have all of the data available to them. And what they say is that all of the things that you would look at for demographics is absolutely garbage. They have better predictors of this. And so there's a simple example of that comes out of the type of movies that you watch. And there you can go to stereotype. You know, men watch more action movies and rate them higher. Women watch more romantic comedies and rate them higher. So demographics and stereotyping would say market romantic comedies exclusively to women. Now that misses all of the men who like romantic comedies, folks like our donor voice partner Josh Schwichard. It also misses women who hate romantic comedies. My wife is one of those people. So Netflix, instead of saying we're going to use these stereotypes to inform, and these stereotypes, as you can see, are somewhat based in truth, but it's a broad brush rather than a specific look that you can have at someone. They market romantic comedies not to men or to women, but rather than to people who watch romantic comedies, as should you as organizations. There's not much difference between this and the broad stroke segmentation that we get at some nonprofits where men's address labels will have the anchors on them and women's address labels will be adorned with flowers. That's a way of nibbling around the edges, but it's not customizing a piece to that person's taste. And more importantly, it's not customizing them to your organization. That's something any organization can replicate. We want what makes you unique and special. And so you see these segments, demographic segments, fail on the first criterion for is it a good segment? Is there more difference among segments than there is within the group? And it fails there. So demographics are not predictive of whether someone's going to give. And certain demographics that you've heard probably from your board, possibly from C-level executives, everyone is saying, oh, we need to go after millennials as a demographic. And I want to pay special attention here because there are special attention paid to this age group. You have these myths about who millennials are and how they're different from every generation that has come before them. The trick is that they're all myths. The whole millennials prefer cities to suburbs. A 25 to 30-year-old today is less likely to live in a city than 1 in 2,000. Young worker job switching is actually down from 1 decade ago and down from 2 decades ago. The whole millennials want a trophy for everything that they do. IBM did a study of generations in the workplace, and it said that millennials are only slightly more likely than Gen Xers to want recognition from their boss and less likely than baby boomers to want their views solicited by their bosses. It's Gen Xers, not millennials, who think everyone on a team should be recognized. And the idea that millennials are uniquely socially conscious, that same study found that millennials were less likely than Gen Xers and boomers to want to follow a job, to leave a job to follow their heart or save the world. Oxford Economics found it the same way. Only 1/5 of millennials said that making a difference is important to their job satisfaction. So all of these things that you've heard about millennials are wrong or misplaced. Add in the whole idea of millennials are uniquely suited to the tech atmosphere, so are going to be the generation after them. That's going to be a continually evolving thing, because every generation is going to be more acclimatized to the technology when they were born. Additionally, European researchers looked at the values by generation and how they differ, and the answer is really not at all. You can see, I know that's a little bit of an eye chart there in terms of value segments, but all of those segments look pretty much the same, where Gen Xers versus Millennials versus the post-war generation have for their values in terms of challenges, whether they're achievers, whether they're socializers, all of those sorts of things are relatively similar across organizations. So it makes more sense to talk to people who they are and not by generation. So we can clearly bust all of these millennial myths. I think it was put well by Mark Ritson that millennials do exist, but the idea that someone who is the same just because they were born in 1981 versus someone who was born in 2000, and those two people will uniquely think in the same way and want similar things out of an organization is bull. And the idea that they differ from older cohorts in significant ways is also bull. They, like all of us, are unique people, individual people that we can market to in very specific ways. So that's demographics. Now let's get into transactional data. And transactional data isn't bad necessarily. Someone who gives is more likely to give in the future. So it does have the value of being predictive. That said, it's useful mostly on the margins for in and out segmentation. Should this person get this piece? So it helps you get efficient, on the margins, should this person receive this communication, but it's not good at telling you why someone gave or if the reason that those two people gave is different. So you take two people, Linda and Susan, born the same day, both white female Americans, and they're both donors to a disease organization. If Linda has the disease that your organization fights, she's a volunteer, she's fought back the disease, she's volunteered to help with other people deal with that disease. She gave $40 4 months ago. Susan has a distant uncle who died of the disease, who she made an honor memorial gift about. That was 3 years ago. She mostly forgot about you. Then she saw you again, thought of her uncle, and gave you $30. Those donors are entirely different. They should be in entirely different segments, getting entirely different messages. One related to how they've overcome the disease, the other related to other aspects of your mission, but through the lens of a traditional recency, frequency, monetary value lens. Those are 4 to 6 month, $25 to $50 multi-donors. The other problem with efficiency is that you can efficiency your way into a grave. There's a great example from ASPCA a number of years ago, where they cut out a bunch of their tipping donors, people who gave under $10 over and over again. They just weren't getting good value from those donors. And when they did that, the bottom fell out of their legacy giving program. Those donors who were giving that amount, they were saving up their money so that upon their passing, it would go to a valued organization. And that's why it's so important to segment folks by who they are and how committed they are to your organization, not the immediacy of how their gift might help you today. When you look at efficiency only, you're only getting in and out segmentation. You can only customize, you can't customize a piece based on how frequently did they give, or you can barely do it. So it's important to look at identity first, segment based on that, create your pieces based on that, and then do your binary segmentation as to who within those identity groups should get those communications. There's a great example of this looking at one of the things that's commonly used as a segmenter, channel segmentation. Channel segmentation gets to be this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that if you get a male donor, they're always going to be a male donor and they live in that silo. Event donors are the same way. Event donors live in the event donor silo. And there's not a lot of difference in their commitment to the organization or in their amount of total giving, other than this potential accident of history to how they came to your organization. Now let's look at the bottom chart. Those are the same donors grouped by how connected they are to the cause. Direct connection to the cause is someone who is directly impacted. This is, I believe, a hospital example where they have stayed in that hospital, been cared for by that organization. Indirect connection is you know someone and care about someone who's been connected to the organization. No connection is I don't know anyone, haven't been there myself, but I think it's a good organization. Here, you see cross-pollination across channels. Their mail giving, their online giving, their event giving, it's all jumbled up because all of these people have a mailbox, an inbox, a phone, a SMS device, that they can choose how they want to interact with the organization. That is their choice, not the organization's choice. You can also see that total giving varies significantly. Someone who's directly connected to the cause gives almost twice as much than someone who has no connection to the cause. And I should mention that this organization did not do anything different for direct connection, indirect connection, or no connection. Those audiences were all giving the same pieces. So that value is completely untapped value. They're not changing their messaging at all. That's something that then becomes actionable. You can change your messaging and increase the value of each of these people by knowing why they give. So in this example, direct beneficiaries aren't just the most valuable, the most committed. They also want completely different things from the organization. In this case, 60% of the relationship that these direct connection folks had with the organization was their involvement with the organization and patient care services. 60% was all about that aspect of the mission. For those who didn't have a connection to the organization, literally 0% of the relationship were patient services. Didn't care about them at all. They were more interested in research activities, how do you benefit the community, all of those sorts of things that are other parts of what this organization's mission did. So if you're designing a mail piece, an email piece, a phone script, an event for these donors, you have entirely different messages, or should have entirely different messages to how you'll go after that person. And that changing that message, as Kevin will talk about, will yield far better fundraising results than what do I do with this channel? What's my next mail piece? What's my next email? In the same way then that how do I build a bookcase is going to get you better results in terms of home improvement for getting you a bookcase than what fun thing can I do with a hacksaw and a welding set? So another point to make here is that the direct connection folks here are good donors. They're very good donors despite the messaging they've gotten. No customization, they're still good donors. So that's something that you can't erase, but you can lean into and get better results. So now, in summary to this, which of these pairs belong together? Well, you need to know more than just their picture. You need to know more than their demographics. You need to know more than their revealed behavior. You need to know more than their transactional record here. Even if you're the same age, sex, gender, sexual orientation, etc., as your neighbor. If I'm caring for a loved one with cancer and my neighbor is not, I will react entirely differently to a cancer charity than my neighbor will. That same goes for alumni who had a good experience at the college. The same thing happens for conservationists who take regular walks in the park versus those who are still conservationists who prefer to do their activities inside. Those are messaging points that bring some people together who don't look like they belong together in a traditional aspect, but that those differences in demographic groups are far greater than the differences between them if we're trying to understand needs and preferences. So now Kevin's going to talk a little bit about how those differences go together and how you can profitably talk differently to these groups.
Thanks, Nick. So just to add another summary level here, we've talked about the different types of data, first party, second party, third party, and made the case along with that e-consultancy report that first party data is where it's at if we're talking about trying to get true understanding around motivation and need, i.e. strategic segmentation, and demographics just aren't going to get you there. Now, the limitations of certain types of data and the rules of market segmentation, meaning that these segments need to be different from each other on things that matter. All of those things tend to get hidden and obfuscated a bit when you see a chart like this. And this is actual work product that's been done for a charity in the UK. And you've probably seen something similar to this, and it probably has a persona type label to it. In this case, our persona is Lisa and David. And on its face, there's lots of data here that looks really interesting, and more than interesting. It looks like it's in fact tied to motivation. We've got supporter drivers and motivators and channels of interest and all these other places that they might interact with us and provide support. Now, the reality of this is that what's driving the segmentation, in spite of the pretty picture, is a lot of donor transactional data and third-party external data, namely demographics and psychographics. So we know, based on what we just covered, that the fundamental segmentation is flawed. We've used this data that anyone can have access to. That's third-party data. Just pay a provider. It's all the same. By definition, it is impossible for you to have a segmentation that's truly differentiated if you're using publicly available data. And just tucking in your own RFM data, you probably knew before this session that is not going to get at critical why questions. Why do they support? What are their specific needs? So it's fundamentally flawed from the start. Now, what hides that a bit is that on top of that base segmentation, and this gets wonky and in the details, is some survey work that's been done to kind of layer on top, if you will, some of these more attitudinal needs-based insights. But it doesn't take much digging underneath the surface here to really uncover what's going on. And you can see that here, these are the 10 segments that were identified with this clustering, this technical solution to combine a bunch of data, put it in a stew, and spit out some segments. But what you can see is that there's a really strong pattern with age. And what happens oftentimes if you include demographics or even transactional data, and even if you have attitudinal data, the demographics and the transactional data kind of crowd out the rest of the information. And so what's really driving this segmentation is age. And we've made the case that age is crap for donor understanding. Age is crap for darn near everything other than just pure descriptive. So this is an age-based segmentation at its core. And the other part that gets sort of hidden with all of this, but you should be as sort of a cautionary note whenever you see these personas, is to realize that this description doesn't actually describe anyone perfectly within the segment. So there is no Lisa and there is no David. This is much like some of the other bits that Nick was referencing, just an aggregate, a superficial aggregate. And that would be red flag number one if you're looking at past work or considering future work around segmentation. Is the segmentation going to be nothing more than just some superficial aggregate? Because oftentimes you've got some of these pretty fundamental errors underneath. Now, even if you can get past some of these core flaws in the way in which the segmentation was done, one of the other things that is going to come to bear when you've got demographics and other third-party data and transactional data in there is that it's not tied to motivation or need. And this is illustration of that. This is, by way of orientation here are our 10 segments, 1 through 10. And we know, based on that prior slide, that this is really just an age-based segmentation. So as I go up from 1 to 10, people get older. And I mentioned that they did a survey on top of the segmentation. So segmentation was first, then go out and conduct a survey to try to get at things like what you're seeing on the screen, reasons for support. So let me highlight the third most cited reason for support. In this case, it's tied to religion and faith. So overall, across all 10 segments, 34% of the people indicated that as a a reason for supporting this particular charity. What you see in this table is the indexed values up against that choice. Meaning, if it's over 100, it means more than 34% of the people in that segment are motivated by religion or faith. And if it's under 100, the ones in red, it means fewer than 34% selected that as their motivation. So you see a very clear pattern that as you get older, religion or faith tends to matter more. So what do you do with that? I mean, are you going to send out a communication that has messaging or has other, maybe it's a prayer request or whatever, so some sort of activity that is clearly and overtly tied to religion and faith? Are you going to send that to the older segments? Well, the problem with that, in our view, is that you got lots of missed opportunity. This is analogous to the romantic comedies and sending it just to the females. In this case, if you just send it to the older folks, which is what is represented up in these segments, we've got a bunch of people who, in fact, are not motivated by that. And so at the very least, it's off message and maybe off-putting. And then on the other end, we've got missed opportunity by not sending it to younger folks because, yes, they will, as a cohort of younger people, there will be a lesser percentage that are motivated by that. But why make these constrained and limiting and suboptimum choices? Why not focus on creating a segmentation that gets you to a group of folks who 100% of them, every single person in that segment, is motivated by faith? And by contrast, a group of people where 100% of them are not motivated by faith. Then you've got optimization where you can really tailor not just message, but the entire experience based on these motivations or needs. That is a segue to this identity concept. Identity is a sort of wonky social science term, but the important thing to understand about identity is that everybody has lots of identities, every single person, and those identities are only going to be relevant or germane in certain contexts. So on this session, my professional identity is activated and my sports identity or my parent identity is totally irrelevant. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because, as it turns out, these identities, these identity hats, these sort of metaphorical identity hats that we wear in certain situations, they have different values and goals attached to them. And when a certain identity is activated, folks behave in a way, make choices in a way that are in concert with the values and goals that go to that identity. That means that if we unearth the identity that is active when they are considering or actively supporting our organization, then we have opportunity to make every communication, every interaction, either implicitly or explicitly, make it very clear that when you interact with us, when you support us in various forms or fashions, it is reinforcing of your identity. That's what's going to drive long-term support. Here's a very tactical, specific example of the upside of tailoring message in this case to match identity. So this is some Facebook advertising that was done trying to drive leads to a donate page. And in this case, the audience that was selected was anyone who fell into the health field, health professional. This is a subset of some of those titles or occupations that we were directing this advertising towards. And we had a test and a control. The control is a standard one-size-fits-all, where the message here is not tailored specifically to anyone. And then the test, we changed the language in the lead message here to very specifically and explicitly reference their identity. And here's the difference on that click-through rate to get to the donate page. Okay, so the idea of tailoring message to match identity and specifically and explicitly make it clear that by supporting us, we're going to reinforce this identity is a way to get lift. Now, this is a superficial example in that all we've done is tailor message. What we're going to dive into next here is a process and a methodology that allows you to go beyond just message and fundamentally change this thing that we call donor journey or donor experience. And so we'll serve up a case study here. This is RSPB. For those not familiar, it is a nature conservation charity, and historically focused on birds, in that the B stands for birds. They have made some changes in sort of how marketing was done and how to have a broader kind of proposition in the marketplace than what has been historically. So just by way of sort of context and setup here, I want to walk you through the process that we went through to uncover the identities that were really germane, and also the associated kind of needs and preferences that made them different. And just to give away the ending a bit, not surprisingly, because the B stands for birds, there was an identity of the supporter base that was tied to that. These are birders. These are people who are bird enthusiasts. And the second identity that we unearthed were people who were what we labeled general nature enthusiasts. So they were supportive of conservation and all sorts of flora and fauna. And we found out that, not surprisingly, when you think about those two groups, and all of this starts to sound obvious after the fact, they had different needs and preferences from this organization, which means we ought to be marketing, communicating, and creating experiences that are very different and tied to those identities. So how did we get there? Nick had mentioned at the outset that in our view, you've got to start with, before you even think about segmentation, you've got to start with the more sort of threshold critical question, which is, why do people do what they do? And what we're going to reveal here is a model and a framework that is tied to relationship theory that we have validated time and time again as a foundational, at least partial, if not mostly accurate and complete answer on why people do what they do. So bear with us as we go through the conceptual bit, and then we promise we'll get more specific here. Behavior is what we're after, right? It doesn't matter if it's giving behavior or doing behavior or both. And then this is intended to reflect on the left all that time, effort, and spend, organizational time, effort, and spend across a host of functional areas. And what this chart is suggesting is that there's a piece in the middle that we're missing. If we're trying to figure out how we optimize our time and effort to steer and nudge behavior, in order to get that answer, we've got to get this piece in the middle understood and solved for. So and this is the way to think about this conceptually, is moving from left to right. So we put all this time and effort into creating experiences. Those experiences can be abstract in the form of just consuming kind of passively messages from the organization. They can be very tangible, event attendance, or a donor service interaction, or a telemarketing interaction, or a face-to-face interaction of some sort. So they can also be very formal and push-based, the e-newsletter that goes out the door, a whole host of things from abstract to tangible that constitute ultimately experiences. And every time the donor is exposed to or has some sort of interaction with the organization, there's a judgment that's made. Now, we will be the first to grant most of those judgments happen very quickly and subconsciously. And it includes, to be sure, taking the direct mail piece and throwing it in the trash and deleting your email instantly. Now, we might all assume that that's a negative behavior and a negative judgment that's been rendered, but that's probably not the case in lots of instances, where taking the direct mail piece and throwing it in the trash could mean that we've got some positive mental credit just by virtue of the fact that they've seen the brand, they've processed it, they know we're still out there doing what it is we do, and they just don't have time, energy, or wherewithal at the moment to open it up and get any more involved with that particular direct mail piece. Same thing for email. So the point is, these experiences, these judgments are occurring, and we don't have a good measure of that on our CRM. So part of what we're going to be making the case for here is that if you want to crack the code on why people do what they do, and then the related question of, is that answer different for different folks, we have got to get some missing data to conduct this analysis. The next thing that happens after these judgments are made kind of continuously and over time is that some of those judgments, this was a good experience, that was a bad one, have a direct and causal impact on those three gray ovals that you're seeing. Those three gray ovals collectively represent a measure of relationship strength. And I won't go into the minutia of the methodology or deconstructing the parts here. If you've got follow-up detailed questions, we're happy to be responsive to those. Just know that this thing called relationship is not soft and fuzzy. It can be measured. You're seeing the magic 9 questions that are required to measure relationship strength. And then by extension, as relationship strength goes up based on experiences that are positive, it has a positive impact on behavior. If relationship strength goes down because experiences are deemed to be bad, then behavior is going to go down accordingly. And then identity is just the threshold question, again, of once you uncover which of these interactions and experiences are actually having an effect, and by extension, which ones aren't, you come back to the second question of, is that answer different for different folks? So just to underscore a critical point here, there's just data that's missing if you're trying to get an answer on why people do what they do and whether the answer is different for different folks. So everything that's in red, you don't have this data on your CRM. At best, you've got a very weak proxy for it. And as we've made the case, you can't go out and buy this data. It doesn't exist. You've got, this is first-party data of the first order, meaning it's going to be user-provided data that we need to collect. So I'm going to go through sort of the output of what you can uncover if you build a model like this, I guess, by way of slightly more detail. And again, we don't have this isn't the format or time allowed to go into great detail on the model, but happy to answer those questions. What you need to do is a survey at a point in time. This is a data collection exercise to get this missing data. And I'm going to show you the output for it. As this slide references, it is, yes, a bit of an eye chart, but I'll give some additional orientation and illustrate where the survey data is collected and of what variety and how that gets combined with the transactional data. So what you're seeing on the screen is what we would lovingly refer to as the retention blueprint. And this is that commitment model that we conceptually and generically looked at applied to a specific organization. And as you can see, this is just the bird enthusiast blueprint. There's a totally separate blueprint for the general nature enthusiast. So that's how we validate these identities as being not just existing in an ephemeral sort of sense, but that they exist and they have different needs and preferences tied to the organization. Is we do this modeling exercise in an iterative fashion. Once for kind of the total sample, the sample is going to be all the people who responded to the survey combined with all of their transactional data. And then we'll start to build separate models for these identity groups. And so in the work for this organization, we had to ask in the survey whether they consider themselves to be more of a birder or a general nature person. And people were very able to answer that question. What we didn't know is whether that mattered, whether they had different needs and preferences. And the only way you can really arrive at that is indirectly through this modeling exercise, where we built the birder model and then the general nature model for the folks that fell into those respective cohorts to see if the answer was different. And what you're seeing on the screen by way of orientation is in some ways like the ultimate attribution model, or at least much closer to what one could consider the ultimate attribution model. We're trying to apportion credit where credit belongs. What's actually driving their behavior? Everything that is referenced in one of these boxes or off to the left is where we went from those generic categories that we saw on that conceptual illustration to very organization specific. So all these different interactions and experiences. What we don't know when we elicit that from the client, when they provide that to us, is which of these things matter and which ones don't. That sort of threshold delineation is what is reflected with the middle column. All of those interactions and experiences matter, meaning that as folks have these interactions and experiences, they have an effect on their strength of relationship and their behavior. Everything to the far left is not causal in that way. And then you can also see that not only does not everything matter, but of the things that do matter in this middle column, they don't all matter equally, which is where the value comes in. The financial value is the way to assign relative importance. And then the color coding reflects whether or not it's a good or bad experience. And so at the highest level, you've got some real insight for each identity. This is the birder, and a totally separate one for general nature in this case, where yes, they exist, and now I've got a very specific prescriptive set of insights to not just change message, but to change damn near everything. Okay, this is the definition of being donor-centric. We are uncovering their innate sort of motivation, i.e. identity, and the needs and the preferences that they have relative to this organization. So we went even further as a result of, in terms of this analysis and this exercise, where we uncovered that not all birders are the same. While they're certainly different from general nature, but even within that segment, there is often opportunity to further segment. And that becomes, in a lot of ways, your path to growth. You know, want more money? Get more donor understanding. Don't just bury the bird people in more stuff that is bird specific and be satisfied with the lift that you might get in the first year or two. We've got to dig deeper than that. And so we found in this case that there were some people within that birder category had the same level of connection and affinity to that identity, but some of them were just more naturally indoor people versus outdoor. Well, as it turns out, this is an organization that has lots and lots of assets that they can market and make available to build that relationship. And this allowed us to get very specific on which assets belong to which cohort. And remember, in sort of the control world for this organization and damn near everyone we've come across, it's just a shotgun approach. Everybody gets everything, right? And this is a fundamentally different way to think about marketing and raising money. So this is sort of the final representation of getting us to this donor-centric segmentation. And this is a planning tool where we're actually mapping out donor journey. But in this case, instead of a one-size-fits-all, we're showing for the birder world, we've got 4 different groups arrayed as the rows here. I've got indoor preference versus outdoor preference. We had uncovered some other preferences, like whether they're going to involve their kids in this membership or not, which is very different from having kids. That is a necessary but not sufficient answer on whether or not they intend to involve the kids in this particular membership. And this is an entity that has lots of kids' content. So, and then you've also got whether they're interested in advocacy, because this is an organization that also does campaigning or advocacy work. So just to illustrate a few of the ways in which the experience is very different, because at first blush, it looks the same, right? Just by virtue of the color coding and the number of touch points, and the color coding you can see reflects channel. So Kids Magazine, which historically would have gone to anyone who had kids, is now only going to those people who indicate they're going to involve the kids in the membership. And of course, it doesn't go to the people who either don't have them or aren't going to involve them. We've got a fairly seminal event for them that happens in July that's called the Big Wild Sleep Out. Just by virtue of that name, you can probably judge that's more of an outdoor thing. And historically, it also went to people who had more of an indoor orientation, unbeknownst to the organization, which is part of the reason that you had, low participation there. We were sending to people who had no interest. It didn't fit who they were. So we created another opportunity that was more geared towards that preference and kind of disposition. They've actually own reserves, and so marketing the reserve that was geographically proximate to them and made a lot of sense for outdoor people, not for indoor. Campaigning asks were only sent, of course, to those who were open to advocacy. So a whole bunch of tailoring that goes based on just this fundamental understanding of who they are. All right, so that covers identity, which, as you can see from this visual representation, is the top of the food chain as far as we're concerned. Because, again, just to underscore, identity it's innate to your supporters. It is unquestionably the number one thing driving their behavior, because that identity has these innate values and goals attached to it, and they're always trying subconsciously. They can never faithfully report this. They're trying to behave in a way that's in keeping with the values and the goals that go to that identity. That is the definition of strategy. But there are some other user-defined segments that we had referenced in the beginning that are worth at least briefly touching on here. Commitment is, as we saw from the illustration, one of the constructs that is a part of that relationship strength model. And in a nutshell, commitment and that combination of 9 items, it's measuring all of these latent things, these psychological pieces of who folks are that are dictating whether or not they're going to stick around. So we have some satisfaction dimensions, we have some reliability dimensions, some reciprocity, trust. All of those things are kind of cornerstones of a relationship. And if you have them, you've got high commitment from your supporters and high commitment towards the organization. And if you don't, they're walking out the door and you've got horrible retention.
Kevin, quick question for the audience.
Yep.
Someone would like to know the software that for the screen showing how segmentation and journey mapping is planned out.
Yeah, that's a tool that we use. I'll try to respond to them just offline if that makes sense, but we're happy to do that. We've got a record of any questions that were submitted, so we'll get back on some of those specifics individually if that's okay. But please know that we will do that. And again, you can reach us not just through the confines of this particular session, but after the fact if there are follow-up questions of that sort. So here's showing the difference. These are sustainers. These are monthly donors. So they're giving every single month, and you're seeing, just by way of kind of evidence and proof of the value of knowing commitment, the differential in retention. Not to state the obvious, the high commitment folks are sticking around at a much higher rate. And if you know this at point of acquisition, which is what we highly recommend, you are in essence unearthing who's at risk of quitting before they quit. So you have an opportunity to put your save strategies in place and probably create new ones now that we're thinking about proactively being able to save folks or right size them or find out what sort of relationship, financial and otherwise, would be a better fit for them. You're able to do that before it's too late. And yes, I realize that save protocols can work that are sort of after the fact or after that decision's been made. But we're talking about giving you a much wider lens and looking out the windshield instead of the rearview mirror on the folks who are at risk. What about satisfaction? Satisfaction is, for us, something that ought to be measured not as a global measure, because as a global measure, if you're just talking about overall satisfaction with the organization, and some charities will do this, they'll track that over time. It's an incredibly boring metric because it hardly ever changes. And overall satisfaction with the organization also proves to be not very predictive of future behavior, certainly not as predictive as commitment. Where satisfaction comes in, however, is around specific interactions. And so what you're seeing on the screen is a measure of the quality of the donation experience. So satisfaction is kind of a catch-all term. What you really want to do is think about the diagnostic measure that makes sense for a given interaction. And this happens to be after the website donation, where we were measuring at that point in time something that we just didn't know, and you'll never know unless you ask, and that is whether the task was easy or hard, right? So this is, remember, post-donation, and the assumption, the default kind of CRM world assumption is that, well, it's success. Everyone gave. They made it through the gauntlet, but that's not inaccurate. It's a lousy proxy for what the experience was like, and the only way you're going to find out is to ask folks. And so we were asking them post-donation whether they found that to be an easy or hard process, which our data and lots of others will surface is the number one thing that you want in online world is low friction, low mental effort. Make it really easy. Now, what you're seeing during this time period where the easy ratings were horrible is that the conversion was also horrible. And so once we had not just easy, hard ratings, but we also had some user-provided details around the why of all of that, we made very specific changes in a pretty short period of time, completely flipped the satisfaction ratings or the ease of process ratings, and in a causal way, not just sort of coincidental, the conversion went up dramatically. All right, so to wrap up this session, there's probably been the burning question, even if not officially submitted, like, how do we get to scale, right? Third-party data, we can just go buy it. You can buy it for everybody. And while that's true, that's hardly reason to make use of that data. We would refer to Wayne Duan, who's works at Walgreens, is in charge of digital commerce. And he makes the point that we would echo and underscore here, that you wind up in an effort to get to scale, kind of reverse engineering, perhaps. You've got a sample, you've got this survey that you did, and you've got these clusters, and you want to be able to score the whole database. Well, in order to do that, and it is doable, you have to append a bunch of third-party data, and then you do this reverse engineering where you're able to see these correlations, these patterns, these descriptive patterns that make the segments look different from each other. And then you can use those variables that really just by happenstance kind of discriminate, and you can score up your database. We've seen lots of charities do this. The problem with that is that you lose a lot of precision, okay? And it's analogous to are we going to market a religious message to a bunch of people who don't want to hear it and miss an opportunity for those that do? That's what happens when you wind up using these statistical inferences to try to get to scale. And we would argue that we need to be in the business of really building up our first-party data as charities, as businesses, as organizations. And a part of first-party data that is highly valuable is this explicit customer input. So here are some really tactical, real-life examples of how you can do this. This has nothing to do with resource or money. I don't want to hear that. It's a horrible excuse. All this is about is mindset, okay? We would argue that this explicit customer data, specifically identity and commitment and satisfaction with individual interactions as they occur, is as important as the bank details. In fact, it's more important than the bank details. So by illustration, this is the way that we got to birder nature for the RSPB. There was a hand-raising campaign where they get 200,000 leads coming in the door, all agreeing or having interest in participating in this activity. And of course, as a part of that that phone conversation, there's an attempt to sign them up for monthly membership. We had a portion of those leads get channeled to us, and we started the tailored experience right at point of sign up, right at the acquisition exercise, where we're asking about identity in the telemarketing script, and then we're actually playing that back within that telemarketing script, letting them know they've been heard, letting them know that, yep, this is the organization for you that ties into that identity. We did this because we wanted all of that explicit customer input to tell us who they are and what they need. As it turns out, we actually got lift around this campaign activity, which not surprising to us. And while that's interesting, that is not where the real growth and the real financial value is going to come. The value is going to come from having this donor data. And as a minor aside, the calls were actually shorter, not longer, because that was one of the objections that we heard from the TM shop is, oh, we don't want to deviate from the way we do it. This will make things longer. It's all crap, right? I mean, this is a conversation. It should be a conversation, and we made this much more conversational. All right, just some other illustrations in other channels. This is where you can ask this in the digital arena. This is super easy to do. You should build it into all of your kind of donation process flows where this becomes mission critical data that you're asking for. And again, the mindset has to be it's as important as the bank details. Okay, here's an illustration where in a face-to-face context, we are collecting, this is on the tablet software, commitment, the exact same thing can be done in any digital channel. Doesn't matter what it is. Here's where we're measuring or collecting this identity information for a different charity. Again, this is super easy to do, but you have got to have this be a priority and a focus in order to make it consistent and systematic across these various ways in which people can kind of digitally interact with you. And it can also be done in direct mail. So this is an example for the USOC where we're measuring and asking for commitment and identity. We're giving a lot of physical real estate to this because it's important. And again, that was just a mindset thing. All right, I think we're right at the end of our allotted time. Nick, any questions that jumped out other than the one you referenced that we should try to adjust for anybody who's willing and able to stick around for a few minutes?
Sure. A couple of the big ones. One was how do you collect this information given low response rates on surveys? And then how do you choose which specific identities that you're going for? I think were two big questions.
Yeah, well, and to the first one, I would argue, do not think about this as a survey. This is not a survey. This is an attempt at a census, and it's no different than any country that does its own census, where you try to talk to everybody. And that's what we mean by building this into business process, okay? And if you build this in to your digital process, you can get really high coverage for every single person that comes through. In many instances, we've made it a mandatory field. It's all about the priority that you assign to it. This is not a survey. This is a census. The second question was around how do we know which identities are the right ones? Is that right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, that's a more involved question, and I'm sorry, it's not simple. It's complex. There's very kind of rigorous modeling, which is what we were illustrating on that prior screen, that in our view is required to really validate these identities. Because again, you can ask a question of your supporters, whether it's on a survey or in the digital channel or wherever, about whether they're a birder or a general nature person, and you'll get an answer. And at some point, you've got enough people answering that you'll see some sort of a split. There's 40% are in this camp versus 60% in the other. That's not enough just to know that they exist. There's these other really important parts of, a segmentation being worth the effort, and that is knowing that the needs and preferences specific to the organization are different enough to warrant the extra effort, and it will be extra effort to treat them differently. So apologies for not having a clear, simple, do-it-yourself answer, but it's just more involved than that.
Okay, I think those were the big ones.
Cool. Well, as Nick mentioned, we'll have this recording available for posterity's sake, and then we will go through all of the questions that were submitted, and if we think it sort of warrants it, reply to the whole audience of registrants, and otherwise get back to folks individually if it's a more idiosyncratic type question.
One question just came through. What is the best way to integrate donor identity into a rebranding process? And I should mention, we'll also send out a PDF of the slides, so you don't need to worry about that either. But a rebranding process, Kevin.
Well, I don't know, Nick. How do we want to interpret rebranding? Is that kind of a tagline logo thing, or do we think it's a more material kind of shift in the focus of the business?
What I would say is, whatever type of rebranding you're looking at, incorporating donor identity on the front end is a very valuable thing. Knowing who your donors are will save you from what some people have done in a rebrand, which is go away from where their core audience or core donors think they should be. Rather, using a rebrand or a refocusing of your efforts to focus on the things that matter to your core constituencies is never a bad idea, and it fits right in with what you were talking about in terms of a commitment study.
Yeah. I mean, if you're doing some real meaningful pivot, I mean, some fundamental change in the strategic orientation of the business, and maybe that's just the marketing side catching up with where the mission side's always been. You've got there's a real possibility that you are in fact broadening the tent and getting yourself exposed to other identities, like the general nature one with the RSPB example. It was not a rebrand in that way, but the top line marketing started to have images of animals other than birder, and not surprisingly, they started to bring in disproportionately at that point folks who were not exclusively hardcore birders. Okay, so but the birder bit, to Nick's point, was still core to them. It was core yesterday, it was core today, it's core tomorrow. And not only is it core, it's probably driving the lion's share of your current and immediate future revenue. So you better make damn sure that whatever repositioning you're doing is going to be able to cater to those folks, or at least go in knowing that you put those folks at risk if you're fundamentally changing who you are and no longer speaking to those people the same way.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. As we mentioned, we'll get out a recording and a PDF of the slides. Feel free to follow up with Kevin or me, or both, for any additional questions you have, and we'll get back to you with answers to your questions as well.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate the time and the interest. Take care.
Bye.